Hi, my name's Phil. I like to talk about politics. In this video, I want to cover a few things. The main thing being the judgment that was announced today, where the judge at the Court of Session in Scotland has basically said that they trust the government to obey the law and that there's no need for a court order as yet. Secondly, there's another interesting court case that may be happening. There's a rather baffling article that's just appeared, which is really breaking news, in the Daily Telegraph, about Boris Johnson's intention to pursue a court case, which I want to talk about as far as I'm able to. And then finally, the much more important court case in the Court of Session tomorrow. But first, if you find yourself enjoying the video, then please click the like button and subscribe to the channel. So, last week there was a hearing, and I want to distinguish between this because there are two separate court cases in the Scottish Court of Session. Last week's was essentially all about what do we do with Boris Johnson if he breaks the law? The one tomorrow is really about what do we usefully do if he breaks the law? So what the judge has said, they gave their judgment today, and they've taken the view that the government have given assurances that it not only understands its obligations under the Benn Act, and if you're ever looking this up, by the way, I always refer to it as the Benn Act, it's more colloquially known as that. Technically, it's the European Union Withdrawal Act 2, but we call it the Benn Act for short. But not only has the government written to the courts last Friday to explain that it understands its obligations, but also that it fully intends to comply. So that's enough for the judge, Lord Pentland, to decide that, well, there is no court order required. The government has said that it's going to comply. Now, that doesn't actually necessarily represent a victory for the government as such. You might think, that's great for Boris Johnson. He's won. There's no court order forcing him to obey the law. But, I mean, you just have to say those words and you realise, well, hang on a minute, that's a bit silly. Everyone has to obey the law, including the Prime Minister. So although the petitioners didn't convince the judge of the need to provide an order now, so that immediate action could be taken to arrest Boris Johnson if he fails to comply by October the 19th, it wasn't great for the government either. As a result of this court case, they had to submit in writing the detail of their obligations. That means not only seeking an extension, as laid out in the Benn Act, but they also had to say in this submission that they understand that they're not allowed to frustrate the aims of the Act. Now, given that the stated aim of the Act is to prevent a no-deal Brexit, Boris Johnson has basically said, I understand that I am not allowed to take this country out of the EU without a deal. So should Boris Johnson now carry out any act that's designed to move us in the direction of a no deal, he'll not be able to plead ignorance in a future court case. I mean, hopefully that wouldn't wash anyway, but he definitely won't be able to say that. So as part of the judgment, Lord Pentland did also say that if Johnson did not comply with the Act, it would be, and I quote, destructive of one of the core principles of constitutional propriety and one of mutual trust that is the bedrock of the relationship between the court and the Crown. The veiled threat, I suppose, being that the judge has said that the government have submitted in writing their clear intentions to obey the law. If they don't do so, then they've lied in court. That's not only contempt of court, that trust has broken down and the court's fury will be felt in Downing Street. He mentioned during the hearing itself last week on Friday that a failure to comply, now that a written submission had been made to the court by the government, could itself constitute a contempt of court. And if he's held in contempt of court, he can be arrested. The problem is that although the government have made it very clear in court that they will fully comply with the law in this regard, and they've demonstrated that they understand what that means, they've been saying rather different things publicly. And it's not just saying that we're leaving come what may, because you can imagine the narrative in his head. Of course we will comply with the law, but we're still leaving. Well, how can that be? Well, if he signs the letter and all the rest of it, but then another member of the EU Council decides to veto the extension, and he hasn't played a part in it, then we're still leaving at that point. But Boris Johnson hasn't just been saying that, he has specifically been saying that he will not sign the letter. That would be a breach of the law. But the judge has said that we should separate what politicians say publicly and what they say in court, because they're allowed to lie in public. We know that from a court case earlier this summer. Boris Johnson was taken to court for deliberately misleading the public during the Brexit campaign. The case was eventually thrown out before Boris Johnson even had to take the stand, on the basis that there is no legal compulsion for even government ministers to be honest with the public. They can lie to the public, it's fine. They can mislead the public, yeah, it's fine. Legally it's fine, obviously morally it's not. They can lie till their black heart's content. There's no law against it at all. The court said that it was for political opponents to call them out, not the courts. That was the case at the start of summer. So what the judge in this case is saying is that we should listen to what the government have told a court of law, because if it lies to the court, they are in serious bother. Pay less attention to what they say in public, because there are no consequences for lying to the public. Well, there are no legal consequences for lying to the public at any rate. Essentially, the judgment is that there are no grounds to believe that Boris Johnson will refuse to obey the law. So until he breaks the law, which can't possibly be determined until October the 20th, then the courts can do nothing more with this petition. Naturally, there's an appeal. I mean, as with all these court cases, whoever loses is of course going to appeal. The stakes are so very high for both sides. So they're all going to end up in the Supreme Court eventually. But there was a rather baffling thing. It just flashed up on my phone, actually. I'm just going to read it from the phone, just as I was sitting down to do this. Now, this is an article in the Daily Telegraph. So for those who don't know, the Daily Telegraph it's a Tory newspaper. It supports the Conservatives. It also has had Boris Johnson at various points writing for it. It's got a very close relationship with him. So it is quoting Downing Street sources, government sources. This is actually really annoying at the moment, actually. Lots of newspapers are doing this. Lots of media are doing this. The government are taking advantage of it deliberately. So basically, they release some information and it's not attributed to anyone. So it's like Downing Street source or government source. The idea being that if this mad scheme goes down like a lead balloon, they can always deny that it was ever the government's official position, and the person who gave the briefing to the media sort of overstepped their authority. They didn't have the full facts. They do it to test the waters, and the media really shouldn't be playing ball with this. They should now be naming their sources. But what they've been saying is that the Prime Minister, according to this paper, and this paper will have a good link, that the Prime Minister is willing to go to the Supreme Court in an effort to avoid having to write the letter asking for a delay to Brexit. The article is pretty baffling. I don't want to read the whole thing, obviously. But it says here, the source said Number 10 needed to find a legal mechanism to allow the Prime Minister to at least say 5 days before October the 31st, say, I am literally not going to write that letter. What? It's absolutely baffling. You know, Donald Trump today was saying about Turkey, if Turkey steps out of line, I'll destroy their economy. I've done it before. It's that level of madness. It's on that level of madness. What this source is allegedly saying is that Boris Johnson is proposing to go to the Supreme Court to ask the most senior judges in the land, can you let me break this law? It's really inconvenient for me. I really don't want to have to obey it. You cannot believe how awkward it is for me. In all seriousness, what the hell is that about? But again, the fact that they won't attribute the source, I've no doubt that this is going to go down as one of those things where they say, the person briefing really didn't know what they were talking about. But it is absolutely baffling. So that at the moment is something they're clearly wanting to get out. And I suppose they're trying to get this sort of thing out to the same sort of people that would believe that the judges were biased when they found against the government, and that the government are totally in their rights to shut down Parliament, shut down our democracy, to deliver a no-deal Brexit that is against the will of the people and against the will of Parliament. But anyway, that aside. So tomorrow's case, which is it may be today's case if you're watching this on Tuesday, but the one coming out on Tuesday the 8th. So the hearing on Tuesday the 8th, I don't know when the decision would be. But again, bear in mind, whoever loses, they're going to appeal to the Supreme Court anyway. So Friday's case was all about how can we punish Boris Johnson or any ministers basically that breached the Benn Act. partly to feel better about ourselves that if he does that, he'll at least be in jail, but mostly to act as a deterrent to stop him breaking the law in the first place. The court case tomorrow in the inner court of session, so a bit higher up, well, quite higher up. And this is all about remedies. This is all about, okay, so let's say Boris Johnson does break the law. Punishing him, great, doesn't really help us. We need that letter sending. What can we do to make sure the letter gets sent? And that's it. That, you know, tomorrow's case is literally about what do we do if he breaks the law to make sure that the intention of the act still occurs. Now, the petitioners ideally want the court to say that they can sign the letter, not the petitioners, the court, the judges, if the Prime Minister does not, or at least say who could. If necessary, they also want them to be able to sign any acceptance of an alternative extension offer. Remember, the Benn Act doesn't just say we need to send the letter. If the EU come back with another extension, the EU is spectacularly unlikely to say, yeah, extension until January 2020, that sounds good. That sounds terrible. They're likely to want to give at least a year, I would have thought. So certainly from what I've been hearing from some quarters, maybe even 2 years. So let's say they come back with an alternative offer. The Benn Act says that the Prime Minister has to accept that offer and then bring it to Parliament for a vote within 2 days. So if Boris Johnson refuses to sign the letter in the first place, obviously he's also going to refuse to sign the acceptance, isn't he? So they also need the court to say, well, whatever remedy you come up for signing the letter needs to apply for signing the acceptance and getting it to Parliament. Now, although I'm out of my depth in terms of legal likelihoods, without the wisdom of experts in this field, I would think that this perhaps has a better chance of success than the verdict that was delivered today. The fact of the matter is that time will be in very short supply by the time it's determined that Boris Johnson has broken the law, if indeed he does. It's also known that he will seek to frustrate the functioning of Parliament as much as possible. So, you know, the argument that a just-in-case remedy should be worked out ahead of time would surely be deserving of a lot of merit, I think. Of course, yes, it would be uncomfortable for even senior judges of the Court of Session to have to devise a legal remedy with a working assumption that the Prime Minister of Great Britain and Northern Ireland intends to break the law, but every day's delay, once it happens, may prove extremely costly. And what we're talking about is nothing less than an earth-shattering and pretty permanent change to the entire constitutional makeup of the UK against the will, as I've said before, of both the people and the Parliament. So anyway, that's hopefully you caught up with the legal cases at the moment until we get more news in a couple of days. Hope you find the video interesting. If you'd like to support the channel further, then please click the Patreon link for details. Until next time, I'll see you later.